So we are live now.
Okay.
Good evening and welcome to Carvan's special lecture. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Rohan D'Souza, sir, from the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies, Kyoto University. And today he's going to speak about a very interesting topic and yet very, I think, less discovered, if you can say, in the mainstream history, the environment history. And the topic of the lecture is Engineers, Mud and Fish, Floods and the Making of Modern Rivers in Colonial South Asia. And through today's topic, and we'll get to know the course of the long 19th century, where rivers in the South Asia were radically transformed into modern flows through perennial canal systems and embankment and large dams, the once sprawling and uninhabited flowing rivers, in other words, were recast as objects for colonial engineering. This troubled the making of the modern river in the subcontinent. In fact, remains as yet a little understood story, as I mentioned. So, at the heart of which lay not only the recurring seasonal grief from flooding, but the failure to grasp how slit, mud, and fish were critical to shaping the ecological interweaves between land and river. And to introduce the speaker, though he doesn't need an introduction, he's an associate professor at the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies at Kyoto University. He completed his PhD from the Center of Historical Studies from JNU in 1999, and he was elected General Secretary of the JNU Student Union from 1989 to 90 on the political platform of the AISF, All India Students Federation. He have several postdoctoral fellowships at various universities, including the Yale, UCB, and various other universities across the world. He is the author of Drowned and Damned, Colonial Capitalism and Flood Control in Eastern India, and has jointly edited The British Empire and the Natural World, Environmental Encounters in South Asia, along other publications. So without further ado, I would request Dr. Rohan D'Souza, sir, to continue with his presentation, and that will be followed by some conversations, and we'll take some audience questions. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Ishan. Thank you for that introduction. And let me at the outset warmly thank Ishan for the trouble and for the effort. There was a lot of problem about scheduling this. And I'm so sorry that I should be giving a talk on a Sunday when I'm sure many of you have many more interesting things to do. So I'm going to try and be as compelling, as I'm going to make sure that I try and keep you awake for the entire period of the talk. Yeah. So, but in order to do that, I'm going to have a PowerPoint, and I will speak to that PowerPoint so you can catch some of the ideas and some of the arguments that I'll be making. So bear with me for a minute. Let me screen share this. Right. Share. Okay, Ishan, am I correct in this? Is this
Yes.
looking okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I do the cup, right? Is this correct?
Yeah.
Wait, don't I have to do the, sorry, this is just take a minute. Right. Have I?
Yes.
I have. Okay. All right. Okay. So now I'm set. All right. So as you can see, the title of this presentation is Floods and the Making of Modern Rivers in Colonial South Asia. The key word here is modern rivers. And my argument is that rivers in India became modern in the 19th century. And I often use the word South Asia and not India because British India really spans from what is today Pakistan and Bangladesh. It moved into Myanmar, what is today Myanmar, but then Burma. So we often use the word South Asia to make sure that we capture phenomenon and aspects that happened across the continent, because that was really how vast the British Empire was, right? So we don't only say India. So I just wanted to add that qualification. But let me start by putting forward a basic problem. and that is what is environmental history? All right. We often use refer to environmental historians and so on and so forth, but what really is environmental history? The argument that has been put forward is that nature is not a passive backdrop to the unfolding of human drama. This is the major premise of environmental history, yeah? And that, this is 1 minute. PowerPoint, as always. Okay. And that the whole idea is that, this is the PowerPoint. Again, this is technology. Okay. And the whole idea is that the whole argument for environmental history is that nature is really part of the stage and reveals agency in the shaping of historical narratives. All right, that's the major argument. That is that you don't have nature that is simply a passive backdrop and human drama unfolds before it, but rather that nature itself becomes part of how human agency is shaped and acted upon, right? So environmental history basically says that you have to take environment into the context of understanding how nature plays out in the making of history itself, all right? Even as we argue that nature refers broadly to the non-human world, and history is considered mostly human, right? But the implications of nature in the shaping of human history and the impacts of nature in the shaping of human history is something that environmental historians recognize and are very attentive to. Now, with that out of the way, I want to make a slightly different set of points here. First, I want to argue that writing environmental history can be quite a diabolical and exciting exercise. It need not just be an exercise in really telling us and revealing us relationships between the human world and the natural world, or how some aspects, of weather, made a deep impact on some revolution or whatever, or whether famines really drove certain kinds of changes. No, I'm going to argue here that there are two aspects that if we can be attentive to and sensitive to, we can begin to move environmental history writing in completely different directions. Okay, so these are the larger questions that I want to really take up. One is the question of what I refer to, and I draw this deeply from the book by Londa Scheiberger. It's called Agnotology. All right, she refers to agnotology as the study of culturally induced ignorances. Let me repeat that again. Agnotology, the study of culturally induced ignorances. Yeah, we normally understand ignorance is something that we don't. It means that we don't know something, right? And you remove ignorance by studying it. But Londa Scheinberger, in her book, and I would recommend this, Plants and Empire, where she really refocuses the questions about not how we know, to actually shifting it around by asking, what do we not know and why not? Okay. And in her effort, at the end, she argues that ignorance is often not merely the absence of knowledge, but an outcome of a cultural and political struggle. So you produce ignorance just as you produce knowledge. All right. Just flag that for a minute. Keep that in mind, because at the end of my lecture, I'm going to come back again to this idea of agnotology and the idea of ignorance, and why it's very, very important for us to grasp and understand this concept when at least environmental history is concerned. The second thing I draw from literature, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with Milan Kundera's very famous book, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. So at some point in the book, he argues the first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books, its culture, its history. Then have somebody write new books, manufacture new culture, invent a new history. Before long, that nation will begin to forget what it is and what it was. The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. I'm going to repeat that. The struggle of man against power is a struggle of memory against forgetting. So I'm going to really draw upon these two notions, one of the production of ignorance, and the second, the struggle of memory against forgetting, to tell you this story about how uh, modern rivers were created in South Asia or India, if you like. Okay, and so the story begins really by first acknowledging that the last few years has seen an absolute flood, and I don't mean it's not intended to be a pun, but an absolute flood of books on rivers. Yeah, and all of them have done incredibly well. All of them have been cutting edge contributions to the field, yeah, of history in general as well. So you have, for example, David Gilmartin's Blood and Water on the Indus Rivers, 2015. 2018, you've had Unruly Waters, Sunil Amrit. That same year, Devjani Bhattacharya's incredibly compelling book, Empire and Ecology in the Bengal Delta. You, of course, have The Invention of Rivers by Dilip Dakuna, fabulous read, incredible number of pictures and maps and so on and so forth. A great book, actually, in my opinion. And of course, the classic now, Arup Jyoti Saikia's 2020, The Unquiet River on the Brahmaputra. Daniel Haynes as well, I should not forget, 2017. All of these books have really cut incredible new ground. And for someone like myself, it's almost hard to keep up with the attention that rivers, the study of rivers, are evoking in history thinking and writing. I remember in the early 1990s when I was in my MA program, there were one or two books, Elizabeth Whitcomb and Ian Stone. Basically, this was all the reading that was there on rivers, and much of it was related to irrigation. But suddenly, you have this upsurge in writings on rivers, and it's become a fascinating and interesting subject. And I think, maybe in a year or two, you might actually have an entire course on rivers, just as in the earlier you had an entire course committed to land revenue and peasantry. Yeah, now you just have a full course on rivers because there's enough books on that subject. But in all this, and I don't want to go into detail summarizing all these books and their arguments. I'm just going to say that all these books, though, do not fundamentally address, including one that I wrote in 2006, one simple question. What is a river and what is a modern river? Yeah. And that is what I'm trying to do in this talk, that what is a modern river and how do you discuss its emergence and the transformation of a non-modern river into a modern river. And to do that, the strategy I use is actually to look at how two colonial engineers essentially assembled that idea. Okay, some of you might be familiar with Arthur Cotton. He's in some parts of South India, he's even worshipped. And many of you might be familiar, if not with Proby Cotley, but with the Ganges Canal, or the Ganga Canal now, as it's known, in which cuts through a large slice of Uttar Pradesh. Yeah, and there's a fabulous book by Alan Robertson that came out in 2006, which, fortunately for us, really discusses these two incredible engineers, not only because they were contemporaries in the 19th century, but because they had a very, very difficult relationship. Almost it went into an ugly spat. They disagreed, and to a great extent, their differences and their challenges of each other reveals to us how the idea of the river itself was being transformed. Okay, the idea of the river itself was being transformed. So let me put that more into context. So Cotley is referred to as someone who handled he was called the Bengal School of Engineering. He he was someone who was involved in the northern rivers. The northern rivers is the Ganga, the Ganga system, and it didn't involve the Indus, but he didn't have a big role to play in that river system. And Cotton is the extraordinary celebrated engineer of South India. So you have the Bengal School of Engineering versus the Madras Cheap School of Engineering. That was the different frameworks in which both these engineers were sort of set up. And what is even more interesting for us is that both of them have left a huge voluminous set of writings. So they are not difficult to actually study and to follow, right? And much of this is not really terribly technical stuff. It's really great histories, fantastic stuff, observation, a lot of writings that is as good in an anthropology course as it would be in an engineering course, and so on and so forth. For example, Cotley's book, Report of the Ganges Canal, it's 3 volumes, massive. And I think volume 1 itself is like 537 pages. And a lot of it is extraordinary detail about what is now Uttar Pradesh, and about not just irrigation systems, but land, topography, geography. Cotley was also someone who was a huge collector of fossils. And much later in life, he was also accepted in the Royal Geographical Society, and he held received many awards for his work on paleontology and so on and so forth. Cotton as well wrote a lot, including lots of his writings that were often published in magazines and newspapers. So, and many of them have been brought together into volumes, right? So in many ways, both of them have fairly documented their work and their understanding of rivers, and in some ways have made available to us the kinds of discussions and debates that they had about managing rivers. But what I want to get across to you is that, obviously we don't have the time and space to have a detailed discussion of everyone's contributions and what they did. But I want to, just for the purpose of today's presentation, I want to highlight the question I asked when I read Arthur Cotton's work. I wanted to know that from all his writings, how did Arthur Cotton understand what a river was? Yeah, simple question. Not what he did or how great he was or what are the challenges he took on, which are many, but actually, as he writes, what does he understand the river to be? Yeah, and it's there's a biography of his written by his daughter Elizabeth Hope, who later married somebody called James Hope, and she was called Lady Hope, and it came out in 1900. And she kind of is very helpful because she reviews a lot of his personal correspondence and reveals to us what and how he was thinking as he took on these major projects to come to South India. It also should be said that Arthur Cotton graduated from the Addiscombe Military Seminary in 1819. All right, he was very young, 17 or 18 years at that time, 15, 16, sorry, at about the same time as Cotley. So perhaps part of their, we don't have documentation on whether they met at Addiscombe, but they were there at the same time. And Arthur Cotton was a far more brilliant student than Cotley, and he actually came 5th in the class, and therefore he was allowed to be an engineer, while Cotley actually initially joined artillery. There's also a difference. Cotton comes from a very established family of wealth and privilege. Cotley from a far more humble background. Anyway, to come back to the point. So Cotton built the Anicut on the Krishna, on the Godavari River, and on the Kaveri River, yeah, the South Indian rivers. There's a lot of writings on how he built them. Lots of mistakes also. He wasn't quite the hero until much later years. In fact, Cotley was a far more celebrated engineer when he left India. Not so Cotton. Yeah. Now, in his um, in his constructions of these anicuts, and anicut is really a kind of a dam. Cotton, I begin to study carefully what Cotton writes about rivers and how he describes rivers. And I'm going to be extremely schematic here because we don't have too much time. So I argue, and I've written about this elsewhere, that Cotton really was thinking like a reptile. He was very land centric and not surprisingly, very consumed by the idea of how land revenue could be generated. And in the early 19th century, this was the all consuming uh, occupation of any British colonial officer or any colonial administrator. How do you extract more land revenue and how do you generate more land revenue? So you have to keep that perspective in mind because it is from standing on land that Cotton actually looks at the river. And his daughter writes in her biography of him that for Cotton, his chief problem was how to deal with the river and bring it under control. So obviously, a river not under control is not good for cotton, yeah? And how not to let the water run to waste to the sea. In fact, you often hear engineers, even now today in India, often say that, we build dams because we mustn't waste the water running waste to the sea. We have to stop the water from running to the sea, all right? And he also notes that one of the problems that the Indian rivers, the South Indian rivers, he said, um, these huge forces of water must necessarily, in flood times, be an engine of destruction, or in drought, a loss. So there was a sense that rivers needed to be stabilized. They had a propensity to show extremes, either a flood, which is an extreme event for cotton, or either drought. So how do we actually reduce these extremes and make these rivers into stable channels so that they can yield irrigation water and then ultimately land revenue? Yeah. So if you see how Cotton begins to formulate the problem of rivers in India, he feels that there's a problem of regulation, there's a problem of equalization, that is equalizing the river's flow, it must not have the extremes, and ultimately stability, that the river should be a stable resource. Yeah. And for that, you can see his construction imagination is build embankments, dam with channels for irrigation. Surplus channels should lead the flood waters off to the sea, and you can raise roads and bridges to allow the conveyance of produce to the market. So he had a kind of a 4-point attitude towards controlling rivers. And what emerges from his discussions and his observations is land is property and river is a resource. All right. So you get this kind of, in a nutshell, perspective. Uh, now, Cotley, again, Addisco Military Seminary. The seminary was founded, by the way, in 1809. It didn't really have a very rigorous curriculum, and I can get into that much later when the question answer session starts. But they learned a lot of geometry, trigonometry, mathematics, and that also a kind of a mathematical orientation was very significant to the training of these engineers. Now, Cotley is not the South. As I said, he's from the northern the Bengal engineers. And he worked a bit initially on the restoration of canals in the Doab, that is the Indus region. And then finally in 1842 and between 1842 and 1854, he headed the construction of the grandest project, what is considered one of the most grandest projects in British India, the Ganges Canal. This was a canal that was built totally new in that region, yeah, with new principles, with a new sense of science about irrigation engineering, yeah. And Cotley, interestingly enough, if you read report of the Ganges Canal, what is the idea of the river? How does he see the Ganga and the Ganges in the way that they refer to it in those days? He writes, these rivers, after they debouch from the mountains, a region designed by nature as a great field for artificial irrigation. So the minute he sees the Ganga, he thinks of irrigation. Okay, that's the only thing that seems to compel him. the framework in which he sees the river. He sees the Ganga really as a natural a river for a natural capacity for irrigation, for artificial irrigation, mind you. And then he also notes soil and declivity, every requisite for irrigation, again and again, constantly saying that this is a river that is just so natural for providing irrigation. It's amazing that people haven't thought about it earlier. And the difficulty and danger of interfering with the rivers is the floods of very violent description. So you have a river, and just like cotton, there is a fear of the extreme event, which is floods. All right. So irrigation and floods. So these themes keep coming up in Cotley's understanding of the river. And like cotton, he's arguing what we need is certainty of supply and extension of area under irrigation. All right, this is the imagination by which both Cotley and Cotton come together. Yeah, and again, Cotley is saying land to own and river to control. This is the kind of mantra that he has. So you get a land-centric notion of the river, and the river is seen primarily as something that provides you irrigation. Some of it, is so obvious today, and it makes so much immense sense. Most of us think like that, but I'm going to challenge that assumption as I go on to my presentation. Yeah. So, but what is equally important is that in 1862, Cotton wrote a huge critique of Cotley's Ganges Canal. And Cotley at that time was in England. He wasn't in India. He had almost retired. And the reason Cotton did it is actually far more diabolical. Cotton was working for a private irrigation concern, and he wanted them to buy the Ganges Canal, yeah, cheap. And so he wrote a pamphlet called, a report called, which he supplied to the East India Irrigation Company, 5 fundamental and 14 minor mistakes in this. And I won't get into the details of that because it's quite exhaustive. But that report got leaked. It went to the press. Then Cotley wrote a reply. Then Cotton wrote another reply. And they bickered and fought for almost 3 years, fairly ugly, until the British government instituted a committee of engineers to resolve their debate or their challenges of each other. Yeah. And it was the Crofton Committee. The Crofton Committee got accused by Cotton that, they have loaded the engineers from the northern area. That's why it's the verdict has gone against me. These are the Bengal engineers taking the revenge on the Madras engineers. So the government then had to recalibrate another committee, and it's a very interesting fight as to, it's something like our understanding today of fake news. Okay, that it's not just engineers, but engineers who mustn't take sides, either of the northern engineers or the southern engineers. So it tells you a lot about how objective really engineering is and the science is. But for my interest, it's not so much their disagreements, but what they agree on. What they agree on is the common language in which they discuss rivers. And what you see from Cotton and Cotley is the language of mathematics and quantification. So they talk about the Ganges, the Godavari, the Krishna in terms of volume and in terms of slope. Okay, slope is, the gradient at which the water falls down. So a river essentially was volume and slope. And both of them are discussing this as if they really have objective numbers, even though measurement is really something that is not so objective, so to speak. Yeah, when you measure, how you measure, what your claims are, and what your mathematical models are all quite debatable. But often in their disagreements with each other, they seem to use a lot of numbers, a lot of mathematics, a lot of equations, volumes, and slopes. So the river that emerges is that it is one of volume. If you've got the volume and you've got the slope, there are many things that you can say about these rivers, and you can even make them comparable. You can compare the Cauvery the Krishna, with the Godavari, and so on and so forth. There's an entire language of equivalence that was drawn up. Sort of dry mathematical quantification allows you to compare what historically may not have been rivers that are comparable. So what you get is, from Cotton and from Cotley, there emerges a very modern idea of the river. Cusack plus megawatt. Today, if you talk to many engineers, civil engineers who are dealing with rivers, will tell you cusack is the amount of cusacks they give for irrigation, and megawatt is the electricity that they can generate. All right. So cusack plus megawatt is equal to river. River is made up of volume, the gradient, that is the slope. There's mathematical measurement, and there's universal principles. All right. So it's like a science. And by that, we are trying to make stable channels. We are trying to figure out average flow. And we also create the idea of the normal channel. Yeah. And all this adds up to the idea of perennial irrigation. And then, of course, navigation and hydroelectricity. Now, what is perennial irrigation? It means that I can irrigate at my command throughout the year by holding back the water through a kind of a big reservoir and then releasing it through a canal system as and when water is needed. Yeah, okay. So that is, it doesn't depend on rain. Yeah, it's perennial irrigation. All right. And what is even interesting, and I have to say this, is the use of words like control, domination, training. You know, it will strike you at some point that it's all men. And sometimes they really use language which is so typical of patriarchy. And on the other hand, rivers in India, most of them are feminine, right? So it's male engineers with their engineering and their numbers talking about female rivers, yeah, as requiring control, domination, and training. Perhaps that's a paper somebody else has to write, but it's a very interesting language that begins to emerge with the defining of the modern river. So I end up by saying that the idea of the river as stock is really what emerges from Cotley and Cotton. Of course, I mean, there's lots of details that I have to get into, but for the purpose of this short 30-minute talk, let's just stick to this fact that Cotton and Cotley produce the idea of the river as stock. And if you can see this picture, this is the Indus Basin irrigation system. It's got straight lines. It almost looks like, a graph. It's it's not messy. It's not. It's very neat. Yeah, and this is how the river appears in the imagination of Cotley and Cotton. Yeah. Now, while they were thinking through in this fashion and making it more and more an issue of numbers, they are also simultaneously, both of them are expressing doubts as well. So Cotton writes at some point, he says, actually, I'm not dealing with, look at the word again, I'm not dealing with the virgin river or with virgin soil. Natives, that is the people prior to us coming here, were also using the river. But he says they made use of the river only during the rains when the waters were least wanted. I mean, he's perplexed. Like, native people use the rivers only when it rains. One would have assumed they wanted irrigation when it doesn't rain. Now, Cotley, on the other hand, arrives at something very similar. And they're in many of their writings, the confidence begins to suddenly disappear when you note these observations. Okay, they're very confident when they're writing about their numbers, about what their rivers, how to dam them, control them, etc., etc. Cotley writes a variety of specimens of canals. The method of irrigation was perfectly understood. He says, even before we figured out perennial irrigation, these guys were carrying out some kind of irrigation as well. And what Cotley writes is that, he does follow this somewhat briefly. He says they make cuts into the river seasonal with temporary spurs and embankments, and they drain that water. But now this is the interesting part for Kotley. They use the water, the Mughal period, okay, and even prior to the Mughal, the water is used for hunting grounds, for fountains, for gardens and groves. There's no talk of uh, cultivation of crops, okay, which is what the British are interested in. So it's much more tapping the water for some very luxury purposes rather than actually meeting the needs of cultivators, which, you know, ordinarily one would have assumed that was to be the case. And I can let me say something, declare something very dramatic here. There is no evidence to suggest that canals were built in India prior to the British that were used for a kind of uh, irrigation network. Irrigation happened, but on the scale that the British had sort of drawn out these canal colonies and perennial irrigation, there is no record of that. Yeah, okay. Um, Systematic irrigation, definitely not, as I will explain to you why that was not the case. So they take these observations, and there is talk of something called an inundation canal, which is very different from a perennial canal. Okay. Now, if you see this picture here, it's drawn by somebody called Sitaram in 1810, 1822. You can see, and it refers to a channel built by Ali Mardan Khan, who's also quite a figure. I'll get into that maybe in the question answer session. In Karnal, and this is the encampment of the Raja of Patiala. You can see the horses, the elephants, and so on and so forth. It's a wonderful painting. It's free on the net, so which is why I could take it and put it here. Now, these canals are inundation canals, and the inundation canal really is sort of flagged, but it's not really discussed much by the civil engineers or the colonial engineers. We really get finally a talk and a grand discussion of the inundation canals by someone called William Wilcox, another very famous engineer. Wilcox, I can go on. He's even got a biography about his life in India. He was born in India. He was also a small young boy when the incidents of 1857 took place, and his family had to flee. They lived in tents. They basically escaped with their lives. And Wilcox then went on to become an engineer. His father was an engineer as well. And in 1928 and 1930, Wilcox, by the way, served in Mesopotamia. He served in Egypt. He was very crucially involved in the siting of the Aswan Dam. He had a very global, transcontinental kind of experience working in many countries and many places. But in 1928 and 1930, he comes back to India and he delivers two lectures at the university in Calcutta University, which completely repudiates his entire experience as an engineer. He literally denounces his entire experience. Okay, and he argues to some extent that they got it all wrong. The British got it all wrong, and that India was or South Asia or whatever was the British Empire, India of the British Empire was a vastly irrigated landscape. And he says something like 7 million acres were irrigated, and we have destroyed much of that, and so on and so forth. And then he begins to argue that inundation irrigation really was the way in which that landscape handled the question of rivers, not perennial irrigation. Okay. Now, perennial irrigation means you build an obstruction on the riverbed, which is like a barrage, a wire, or a dam, and then you hold back the water, and then you cut canals on its side. Okay, but you basically dam it and you build a reservoir. In inundation irrigation, there is no reservoir. Okay, what it does is that you make a cut into the bank of the river, all right, at a point of its flood, and then you allow the water to go through that canal, like you saw the Ali Mardan Khan's canal, yeah, cut into the river, and you drain the water only during the flood. And you drain the water because, as Wilcox was to argue, irrigation was for the silt rather than the water. He said it was for the nourishment of the soil, not for the water. Irrigation is not about water, it's actually about picking up the red silt. And then he argued that the red silt that came in, it also brought fish eggs, which then entered the rice fields, and then they spawned and they ate all the mosquitoes. And that this silt was steadily building up the land. And so you never had a drainage problem with inundation irrigation because the water only went to where it would want to go. While in perennial irrigation, you took water where you wanted it to go. All right. So in inundation irrigation, you carefully followed the drainage pattern of the land. So Wilcox then argues that inundation irrigation was an art, not a science. All right. And it meant about having the ability to know how to harness floods. So please remember, if I may remind you, Cotley and Cotton, floods are extreme events that need to be prevented and need to be stopped, either by embankments or somehow stabilizing the river. Now, here's Wilcox arguing the reverse, that actually irrigation is floods. Flooding is a form of irrigation. And the inundation canals were really the art by which the land was irrigated. And for the red silt and for uh, um, the eggs of the fish, which then became fish and ate the mosquitoes and so on and so forth. But he was also talking about another thing. Wilcox was arguing that actually these inund sorry these inundation um, these inundation canals were able to take the silt and the mud and will take the silt and mud and sorry, this shouldn't have happened. Yeah. Um, will take the silt and the mud and help build up the land. Yeah. So he saw inundation irrigation, as a way of um, building up the land, as something that was giving a process and as something that uh, was an art form and not a science. That means to say that every point of the river meant a different history, a history of learning when the flood was happening at a certain point and how to tap it. So local communities, rather than universal science, was central to this entire project. Okay, so for uh, Wilcox, locality and community. That's sorry, I don't know why this is happening. Okay, irrigation as locality, community, and not by universal principles is really what inundation irrigation gives you. All right, so oh, what happened here? All right, so what you get now is a notion of river as flows. All right, in which it's not river as stock, but river as flows, in which mud and silt are central to the river itself. All right, and it's a process of building up land. So now you have river as stock and river as flow. You have two different concepts. And I want to go into the third one, which is the third thing that emerges is there, are there fish in the river? I'll remind you again. So for Cotley and Cotton, a river is really volume, it's just water. For Wilcox, a river is silt and mud, yeah? And no universal principles, it's locality and local community that actually manage irrigation. While in Cotley and for Cotley and for Cotton, it is the professional man of science, the engineer. All right. So there's a lot of tension here between notion of stock and flow. Now, the third thing is something that I want to get across to you, and it comes across almost very innocently. So, sometime in August of 1867, the Secretary of State for India sent a dispatch to the Madras government, calling their attention to a communication from Sir Arthur Cotton, who feared injury to the coast, um, um, to coastal fisheries from irrigation works constructed along the east coast. So people were complaining to Cotton that, now that you built these wires and these anicuts and these dams, it's becoming difficult to catch fish, and the fish are dying. And there were these complaints coming up, and so Cotton felt that, he should send a dispatch to the Madras government and ask them to figure out what is happening. Is it his fault or something else? So the Madras government asked somebody called Francis Day on 27th of March 1868. Francis Day, then Inspector General of Fisheries, was asked to examine the impacts of the anicuts or wires in the Madras presidency. Orissa and Lower Bengal, British Burma, and at the end of 1869, even the Andaman Islands. So he was given a huge task to check out why is fishery being affected by these constructions. And they really systematic, and I think his documents and his papers and reports are something that really requires study and inquiry to this day. Yeah, many of us know of Cotton and we know of Cotley, but we rarely hear of Francis Day. And Francis Day changed the entire way he asked questions. So the rivers are assessed not by irrigation potential, but by what they mean for fish habitats and biological life. So he wanted to see that, okay, I'm going to look at the river as a breeding ground for fish, as a place where fish carry out migration, their connectivity with other rivers, and pulse regimes. A pulse regime is, a regime where the fish move along the river. Yeah. So Day concludes rather dramatically. He says, during the rains, that is from July to September, a great part of the country behind Bengal is underwater and may not be inappropriately regarded as one vast inland fishery. Even the rice fields attracting swarms of fry and small fish. By wise provision of nature, this is also the period when most of the freshwater species spawn. All right. So suddenly Day is arguing that actually the river is not water or mud. The river is actually a kind of a biological uh, ground for the breeding of fish. It is a habitat, to be more precise. It's a habitat that has a pulse, okay, because the great Indian monsoon dramatically connects streams, channels, tanks, ponds, and rice fields into a single sprawling liquid lattice. In the rains, flows are energized as pulse and ebb, which are flush with muscle, fin, cartilage, glutinous eggs, bone, and shimmering scales. Quite a nice way of putting it across. So now suddenly the river is not only an irrigation channel or mud and silt for for cultivation, but actually it is one large habitat for fish. And at some point of the year, the difference between land and water actually disappears. And that's the great Indian monsoon. So what you get is a notion of river as pulse, a river of muscle and fin. Okay, so here's what I'm trying to get across to you. You get flow, you get stock, and you get pulse. Three different notions of the river. All right, and what we then what then allows us to conclude is that the modern river is a marvel of engineering in which floods are a natural disaster. That is the definition of the modern river, is that it is produced by engineering, in which floods are a natural disaster. To put it differently, the domination of stock over flow and pulse. So if somebody asks me, what is a modern river? A modern river is the domination of stock over flow and pulse. Yeah. So let me then come back again to what I said at the start about ignorance. Ignorance is often not merely the absence of knowledge, but an outcome of a cultural and political struggle. Engineering, civil engineering, colonial civil engineering, produces ignorance through its political assumptions about land. All right? Colonial civil engineering produces ignorance through its political assumptions about land, which is why many people think, even to this day, that rivers are about water and volume. Yeah, all right. So that's one of my arguments, that throughout my presentation, I'm showing how ignorance of ignorance of pulse and flow are produced by ideas about stock. So that ignorance is something that has to be unpacked by environmental history. The second thing is the struggle of man against power, is the struggle of memory against forgetting. All right. So the modern river is the power to forget, the struggle against the flow and the pulse. All right. That the modern river purposely makes us forget that a river also has a flow and has a pulse. All right. And therefore, flood is nothing but an act of remembering by the river. So for me, I could argue that flooding, which is held in such great, I mean, this is held as an extreme natural calamities event. But if you were to read environmental history in the way I'm making the case for it, then flood is nothing but an act of remembering by the river. All right. On that note, I'm so sorry for those interruptions. I'll now stop my presentation and I'll welcome any questions. I hope I was accessible. Thank you. Thank you, Shan. I'm so sorry again. I should have turned off my cell phone. Yes.
No worries, sir. Thank you so much, sir,
Yeah.
for this wonderful lecture and the way you have managed to show us the evolution of what you can say, the hydraulic despotism, that is an a term
Yeah.
that is used by many scholars
Mm,
to talk about the modern rivers.
yeah.
So, sir, can you define the role of the global imperial powers in damaging the environment of the 20? You talked about rivers, but talking about environment as a whole, as a general term,
Mm.
can you define the role of these empires in damaging that of the 21st century, especially in the South Asia? These empires expanded their spheres of influence with a buoyant mandate across the globe, with far more consideration given to outmaneuvering their imperial rivals in geopolitical, chess than to the long-term impact of their actions on the people and the natural environment of their colonial possessions. So they didn't think much about their colonies, the environment of the colonies. Do you think that? And can you
Okay,
define the role?
Ishan. Yeah, Ishan. Let me now let me put on my. I mean, let me present myself as a teacher. Okay, right? Um, you know, what is a good question to ask in this kind of a discussion? Yeah. Now, if I say what was the role in damage, what is the role of imperial powers in damaging the environment in the colonies? Now, that's do you damage environments? Sometimes we must be attentive. Do we degrade environments? Do we pollute environments? Do we change environments? Do you transform environments? Yeah, there are all kinds of terms that we have to be attentive to, right? You can damage a painting. Yes, you can degrade environment. You can destroy certain kinds. We can use it in a loose way. Yeah. So the colonial impact is something that has to be studied. If as an academic, you have to be far more nuanced as to understand the colonial impact. There is environmental change. Yeah. Like the emergence of, in my case, modern irrigation, which meant the emergence of perennial irrigation. Okay. That perennial irrigation was not the story of simply progress and triumph, but it was also the story of the suppression of different histories of inundation irrigation and a different understanding of the ecology of rivers itself, in which fish were not taken seriously. Okay, it was not considered a habitat, right? So, for example, forests were considered as places where they held timber for the British. But if you read Upender Singh's wonderful book, Political Violence in India, and there's a lovely chapter which I urge all of you to read on forests. She says that the forests that were really valued in ancient India were the elephant forests, the forests that had elephants. But that same value turned into timber when the British come. Okay, so environments and natures have been transformed, changed, and understood differently across periods of time. So even in the colonial period, you get conservation, you get agendas for, you get a huge science, ecological science to understand the natural world. Yeah. So it's a very complex impact. It's not a one-way street. Yeah. Okay. And now we no longer believe that it is only the colonial regime that profoundly transformed this entire landscape. Yeah, that even prior to that, history was carried out. Histories of change were carried out by people who inhabited this subcontinent. Yeah, empires, forest communities, pastoralists, nomads, etc., etc. There's a huge range, yeah, of impacts. So, but on the question of rivers, what I argue is that there are these competing imaginations which somehow would maybe change the way our engineering itself approaches river management and control today. If they knew that it's a habitat, if they knew that it's silt and mud, yeah, and factored it, and if they knew that there was a lot of art as well, not just science, in managing and tapping rivers, yeah, then we have a very far more complex landscape of change. Yeah, sorry, did I explain myself to you? Yeah. So
Yeah.
rather than going for a big bite, like what are the degrading consequences of British rule, I'd ask for a more nuanced question that can yield some kind of a answer. Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Towards the end, you mentioned about the Bengal's River. So,
Yeah,
in the twilight years of the empire, Bengal's River posed a very big question of water problem.
yeah.
And can you talk about the balancing, quote unquote, balancing of the Bengal rivers as said by the then governor of Bengal, R.G. Casey, as a response to the perplexing hydrology? So, can you talk about the governor's response of the self-assured clarity on how the water problem of Bengal's river can be resolved?
Okay, it's very interesting. You know, from the 19th century onwards, Cotley's Ganges Canal became a defining moment. It also spawned the creation of what was then Thomason College, which was a front-ranking uh, engineering institute university in the world, and now IIT Roorkee, by the way, incidentally. And uh, our our science of managing irrigation really begins to take off from the Cotley cotton kind of way of managing rivers. Okay, and at some point there are also complications that begin to come up: waterlogging, malaria, um, not really getting the profits that they thought they were getting. There's monocultures, there's disease. You know, many of these irrigation projects are experiencing stress, ecological stress, environmental stress. And by the 1940s, the British, the irrigation paradigm is actually beginning to fall apart. None of these projects are actually making money, and of course they are generating white rice and wheat output and so on and so forth. But it is becoming an expensive proposition. And by the 1940s, the American paradigm is emerging, and that is adding megawatts to QSEX. So you get, when R.G. Casey is talking about in the 1940s, he's actually talking about multi-purpose river valley development. So large dams begin to come to India in the 1940s. Let me say something dramatic. It is not Nehru that actually pushes for large dams. It's the British that push for large dams in India. And I say that in my article 2003 and in my book subsequently. But of course, Nehru finesses it. He kinds of takes this technology and reimagines it as an act for national development. Okay, so nation building is something that Nehru brings the idea of large dams and nation building together, and therefore it becomes something that is uh, very central to how he envisions modern developed India. Yeah, but that's a different issue. What I'm trying to get at is it's the American innovations in multi-purpose river valley development that really begins to take off after the 1930s. It's no longer the British irrigation canal colonies, but it is multi-purpose river valley development that emerges. Yeah, which is more intensive in the way they're choosing to dominate rivers. Yeah. Okay. I don't
Yes.
know if I'm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for the audience, can you explain the term hydraulic despotism, and which
Oh,
in turn is also resulting in, I think, flooding of the Kosi River very recently, which is in Nepal and also shares some part in India. So, is it a colonial era holdover that continues to guide South Asia's water diplomacy to a very large extent or to some extent?
okay. First, what is Oriental despotism or hydraulic despotism or what? Well, it's not hydraulic despotism is not the same as Oriental despotism. Uh, you know, um, Wittfogel wrote this book in the 1960s, Oriental Despotism, and he was actually someone who was wanted to criticize socialism. So he says wherever there is state control, then it becomes despotic. And he wanted to use the metaphor of the East, the Oriental East, that these big empires really were about controlling, managing water. Now, this is all his factually was completely wrong. That was not the case, and there are many very substantial critiques of Wittfogel, and one of the best critiques is Donald Worster's book Rivers of Empire, which has an entire chapter devoted precisely to critiquing Wittfogel. So I don't think any one of us can add more to that. Okay, it's a very systematic critique of Wittfogel. Now, that is different from uh, what the British did to transform the landscape. Okay, let me give you a simple problem. All the rivers flow north to south, right? Power goes from east to west. That is Delhi, the relocating of the capital from Calcutta to Delhi. So east to west was the axis. So all the your railway lines cut through with their embankments, and all the roads cut east to west. Rivers flow north to south. So there's a drainage crisis right there. So what has happened is our way, the way we built roads, the way we built the railways, they have actually ended up creating some sort of a drainage congestion. And this is one of the big problems that we continue to. What is flooding today in India is actually a manifestation of a drainage crisis, a circulation crisis of water. Okay, so that can be fixed, but it needs a lot of vision, effort, and thinking. My central argument is that flooding as a disaster is a very takes on a very modern connotation after the 19th century. It's not that floods didn't devastate before; they did, but the nature of the flooding is impacted after the 19th century by various kinds of uh, ideologies about water management and various kinds of physical infrastructure brought in by colonial rule, much of which is uh, continues post 1960s. Today, for example, nobody really listens to a historian about water. They talk only to engineers. Okay, I hope to change that, and I hope some of you will do some exciting work to take that on. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's very important that we have a dialogue between historians, engineers, ecologists, fishing communities, local communities, a whole spectrum of different voices to discuss floods, impacts, and solutions. Yeah.
Yeah, like an interdisciplinary
Yeah, absolutely.
dialogue.
The engineer knows stock. He does not know flow and does not know pulse.
Yeah.
To put it to give you language. Yeah, yeah,
So there's a question from Gurdas Dhawal, and I'll include my last question to that question. That
yeah.
how do you see the contemporary water diplomacy in South Asia, especially between India, Pakistan, and Nepal and Bangladesh? So, did the canal and dam construction set the seed for water disputes, which sometimes happen between states in South Asia?
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Very good question, and this will take a long time, but I'm going to cut it short. You know, political borders do not follow uh, natural flow regimes. So, India and Bangladesh, for example, share 54 rivers. Okay. Many of these rivers keep moving. So sometimes they throw new land, sometimes they change course. So it's not like they're all set in one way, only 54. And when I say 54, it could be many more or many or less, depending on how the monsoons play out. Okay. That's one. India and Pakistan, you know, the Indus system, right? Okay. India and China, the Brahmaputra, and so on and so on. Now, we are caught up in a kind of complication. Sometimes you control the headwaters, somebody else is downstream. Sometimes you're downstream and somebody else headwater. Yeah, and dams as a technology is like being able to uh, control the facts by your location. All right, so China can say, "Oh no, there's enough water going down, but we're going to build a dam." And then you're going to say no, but we are getting less water, and they will keep inventing their numbers. You can keep giving different numbers, which is going on between India and Bangladesh as well. So unless this is not a, I believe that non you cannot securitize water. It has to be sorted out in a kind of a track two level of diplomacy. What do you mean by track two is that many more constituencies must come together, and it should not be only a is a claim of the state. It must involve communities on either side, and it must involve many different imaginations and many different ideologies to negotiate what these rivers are about. Okay, so I argue that the existing corpus of knowledge on water and rivers is based on stock thinking, not flow thinking, not uh, pulse thinking. Yeah. What we, like certain things like environmental flows, which Jayanto Bandyopadhyay, very brilliant uh, engineer, thinker, and someone who writes exhaustively on the subject, said if you factor in environmental flows, you need different kinds of people to talk about it. Yeah. So part of the solution lies in rethinking knowledge and taking on the question of forgetting and taking on the question of ignorance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Okay.
we
Yeah.
have two questions on
Yeah.
Facebook, and the one question is from Rex Hasnu. His question is: did the British use the process of taming rivers as a tool for legitimize their presence in South Asia, or use of the irrigation project for themselves rather than the public at large?
Hmm. Sorry, I didn't catch that. What?
Did the British use the process of taming rivers as to legitimize their presence in South Asia?
Yeah.
And did they use the irrigation projects for themselves rather than for the public?
Well, again, that's a much more complicated question. Obviously, when the British come in, they bring in ideas like improvement. And what is this improvement really? Improvement is that if they generate more land revenue and they collect more land revenue, that's improvement for them. Yeah. And irrigation, they think that, oh, okay, listen, we'll cause famines, and if famines happen, then we don't get our taxes, right? So we are going to prevent famines. Now, Mike Davis's, sorry, Victorian Holocaust, documents how actually, many of these meteorological failures, or the failure of the monsoon, amplified pre-existing uh, inequalities and injustices, right? So it was not only nature acting, but nature amplifying a pre-existing uh, economic and political crisis. Okay, so did they do this, build these large dams for themselves? And yes, mostly it was creating a sense of the improved colony. We are uh, subjects of empire, right? So they don't want the subjects to die because the subjects work hard and give them taxes. So if all the subjects die, what's the point? So there are interventions, there are improvements, but often those ideas of realizing uh, their intentions don't always play out in the way that they wanted to play out. So they wanted to educate us so that they could have clerks, but you had people who took that education and created mass movements against them, right? Okay, so there is a gap between what the British intended and what actually gets played out, and that's why history is important as a subject for forgetting and ignorance. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Next question is from SK Das, and I think this will be the last question of today's conversation.
I see here one from Rohit Jha. Oh, sorry. Oh, that's sent privately. Okay, yeah. Okay.
So, SK Das's question is, can you speak about the period after 1866 famine? How flood was controlled by colonial authorities? You referred the example of 1867 dispatch to the Secretary of India.
Hmm. Okay, very good question, and I'll explain why. In fact, that is really I deal with this in my book, which I must warn you is terribly boring. I think I wish I had the ability like a Ramchandra Guha or even a Mahesh Rangarajan to write elegantly and well, but I don't, and so it's a very dense book. But in that book, in Drowned and Damned, I do explain how the 1866 famine in Orissa really is used as an excuse to push for private irrigation ventures. Okay, right? And we build these irrigation projects because we want to stop famines, but actually, it's really not really stopping famines in any fundamental ways because the crisis of famines is actually extraction, revenue extraction, and the kind of crisis that they created in the economic and social sphere, right? Through for example, the implementation of the permanent settlement, and there are various factors. Yeah, society was already extremely fragile and vulnerable. So whenever there's a meteorological failure, as Davis pointed, it gets amplified, right? And then they thought the argument was that famine is not a problem of political economy. Famine is a consequence of nature. They started blaming nature for what was actually generated by politics. Are you getting it? So if I was to give you an example today, uh, I was watching the Bihar elections and I was listening to people who were giving arguments. So there are two kinds of people. One was saying government has to give us a job. And then there was another set of people who were saying, hey, that's not the government's job to give us a job. We should get the jobs ourselves. Yeah. And so then one asked them, what is the job of the government? That's different. If it's not to give you a job, then what does it do? So, what I'm simply saying is that sometimes you naturalize crisis by saying, let's blame nature. Okay. Or this does not require an intervention from government, like a job. You should get it. It's your fault. Okay. So bottom line in what I'm trying to get across to the question that's being asked is that the famine is not a natural event only. Okay, it is something that is woven into a larger political economy, and you have to unpack it at different scales. Does that help? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and for
Yeah.
doing this lecture. And I think it was an interesting lecture and to understand because we rarely study environment history, and as you mentioned in the last 2 3 years there has been a flood of books on environment history, very interesting books
Yeah.
on environment history. So I think this lecture will help many students, many researchers, scholars
Right.
to reignite the interest in environment history and to understand not just making of the modern rivers, but also environment as a whole and other various topics relating to it. So thank you so much, sir, for
Thank you. And
doing this
can I,
lecture. Yeah,
again,
sure,
I must
sure, sir.
apologize for that cell phone. I really, it was really bad, and set me off for some time. Yeah, sorry
No,
for that. Yeah. All right. Okay.
thank you so much, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.